So, Protick, why don't we begin with you giving us a little description of the title of your show, Till Time Stands Still.
Right.
Once you do that, we'll walk around a little bit with you.
Yeah, so the original title is Nirabodhi, and if you look it out, it often says infinite, but not necessarily it carries the same meaning that we use in Bengali. No, it's a Bengali word, but it has a feeling of till time stops. Um, wait, not waiting, but necessarily something around it. So till time stands still. That's the title. So obviously, time has an important role, I think, in all the works that I have presented in this show.
Your show is truly divided, it seems, into three sections, three interconnected works. And they seem like three interconnected lives that you have. And we were talking about it a little bit earlier, your life as, of course, a practitioner, as a pedagogue, as a person who works within and outside institutions, works with education, but is also looking at, let's say, a kind of cultural history over here. I think the cultural history of partition, the sort of political, social consequences of that, perhaps in a personal kind of way that we see through the archive. So, lead us into your show. Talk a little bit about maybe this first body of work that is in front of us. It's surreal, it's there, which is it's giving a kind of liminal sense of the past and a kind of faded sense of a memory coming into focus. There's a distinct style to how you have documented this place, or you've walked into this space, or the role it plays in with your memory, and how you're recollecting a space. Recollection and memory seems to be an important aspect for you somewhere. So lead us in.
But I think if I feel that if we think about the medium of photography, the very core it has is usually it freezes time. No, that has always been like when I grew up, when I saw the photo for the first time, it was some frozen moment from the past of our family. So that aspect of time is often present, I think, in my work. And this work is looking at a landscape that were uh, separated in a way but from the people during or because of partition. And partition, especially in Bangladesh, has a sort of it has a complex memorial aspect, I think, because we don't there's an amnesia, let's just say. There's a sense of amnesia when we talk about partition, because for several many political reasons, because we became Bangladesh in 71, uh, most of the historical conversation remains or revolves around 71. But partition actually was a very crucial separation for the Bengal, for the larger Bengal. And I was always curious about that, but I was also curious about how these relics speaks about a different time and also are present in a way but almost overlooked or invisible to the public discussion or archive. So I really wanted to just basically document these spaces uh, which became enemy properties post partition, when now Bangladesh was actually East Pakistan. And because East Pakistan had obviously a very different kind of history in terms of the religious conflict and the migration that occurred, these places became abandoned and but just remained there, in decay. Um, and so I wanted to, touch upon those time, which also feels a bit you're not sure which time you're looking at. It can be photographs from 40 years back, although they are very recent photographs, but the subjects of the photographs carries a different kind of age or time in them. So I tried to research these places, map these places that are spread all around the country in Bangladesh, and travel there, do the survey for which I started in 2016, from the 2016, and I'm still continuing. It's an ongoing work, and one chapter I'm showing in this exhibition. So what you are seeing here is mainly lands and palace or architectures, buildings which were owned by the jamidars. And this architecture has a lot of mix of Mughal architecture, the Victorian architecture, and the Greek architecture. But of course, in ruins, they takes a different form. The nature takes over. So nature plays also an important role, and how time transforms certain subjects, even power, something different that we look at now. There was a time when you would have walked past these areas and you have to take your shoes because these buildings and properties were owned by very powerful kings or Raja in our region. That's what we used to call. But it's something completely obsolete now. So I think that's also interesting was to see what power can become, over a period of time, whatever power that is now, or absolute it feels like, especially in this current, regime that we are all living through. So, for example, this is a tomb of the queen in a place called Gopalganj. So yeah, so this work explores a lot of those elements, I think.
So it's interesting that you mentioned this. I think when you said, these were considered enemy territories, I know that you mean enemy within inverted commas.
Right, of course.
Because after all, that was the narrative very much purported by the states on either side.
Exactly.
It was a moment of war. That means there was always the building of a certain nationalistic point of view. I remember this one interesting exhibition, of course, reading more about it, but when Chobi Villa first started, the first exhibition they ever did, of course, was with a focus on 71.
Yes.
And of course, last year there was, as it were, 50 years since 71.
Yes.
So it becomes an important, I think, moment to think about how half a century later that history is being looked at and revived. And so I would think about it also in that context for our listeners. The other thing I'm interested in is that, of course, when you encounter spaces, what's interesting between this location in the exhibition and the room we're about to see inside is that you move from monuments to people to lives.
Right.
So why don't we move towards the archive then?
So of course you can see in the entrance, which is actually the end of that room, but you also enter through this image, where you see an old cup. Not old back then. Of course, this photograph was from 1975, which is from my family archive, and this work is about Mr. and Mrs. Dash, who are also my grandparents.
Okay.
And here in this image, I can come back to this image later while we exit, but I think the work kind of starts from here. And especially here, you see there is a passport of my grandfather, Mr. Das. Of course, the use of passport in this region is also has a certain timeline. So this is a passport from the Pakistan, which was his first ID card. So it kind of, it kind of transitions from that room, and we're looking at something post-partition. But we're also looking at a person or a family who were Christians in East Pakistan. And obviously Christianity came through that timeline of the British rule in our country. So my grandfather, he was a Christian priest, and of course he was working throughout the country more than 30 years for the Baptist mission in Bangladesh. And of course his wife was also being with him, and also the family started to travel with them everywhere they were posted in different districts. So this archives looks at that, we started from East Pakistan, and also slowly here you see Bangladesh, right? You can see in this envelope. So of course this is a family archive, but these are also objects that are precious which were being kept by these people, and I think that is interesting. Archive has a lot of weight in it, no?
Yeah.
But if you think about these objects, these photographs, these letters, this is a letter written by my mom, where she's speaking about her singing career to his father, no? And this envelope, this page, this diary, these are also objects that are very precious to persons or people personally. So what happens when you reach a certain age and you have done everything that you want to do in our life, right? And you retired and you get old, and you also know the inevitable, what is about to next. So that is when I actually started to photograph my grandparents, which is there as you can see. But also I wanted to keep these because these are the only many few remainings this archive are there in their life. You know, even in the work, if you see, there's often photographs that appears within the photograph. Here also, even here, if you look at. There is again what you mentioned. No? There is a collective effort to remember or think and reflect our past and where we come from, especially for them in their last days. So that's the second work.
Yeah, I'm interested to dwell here a little bit, only because the role of personal histories, as you're talking about, in our sort of reconstruction of, let's say, being a document of the time, right, becomes extremely relevant now because so much of it is elided, so much of it is about how individuals move. You know, that transnational history comes into play that very often is not part of the telling of, let's say, the history of a state or the history of a people. And very often now that, you know, one has to also think about the narratives of refugee right now, what that means. And it's very much missing to think about who is an insider, who is an outsider. These have come to play so distinctly in our lives. And it's not difficult to think that during this partition, there was a whole, you know, an entire community was dislodged. An entire community was displaced. At the same time, an entire community found a new home and had to build roots all over again. And this is what's interesting because when we look at the monuments outside that you've documented, or the homes sometimes that have been documented, and then you come over here, you also think of different kinds of settlements, newer settlements that had to be made for people to call home at one point in time. What I find interesting also is that you've also made it part of, you've not left it to history alone, you've made it part of your life, after all. And it's about your documentation and your perception also of your family, of what's happening around you, of this particular kind of history that unfolded. You mentioned something very interesting about 10 minutes ago, is the quote unquote or the bracket unbracket sense of South Asia. Who is South Asian? What is South Asia? And very often when artists are describing their work, there's this binary role that's being played. I am South Asian, but that is not my only identity. That is not the only place I come from. You said something about it. Can you just recall what you said about your position vis-a-vis South Asianism?
But I think just to add what you just said about the settlement, it's interesting because my grandfather also came from Kuch Bihar, which is not Bangladesh or part of Bangladesh. No? He came to Bangladesh from his family, and then he settled to Bangladesh, which became Bangladesh, obviously. So there is that too. I mean, even if you look at our own personal history, there are so many other connections that comes in. If it's there, either you address it or not address it, it is always there. And I think, but then that was a different era and time. No, there was no border technically in this subcontinent. They could just move. The border was obviously constructed later. But now, of course, we all collectively live in a different era where border is still there, maybe more stronger than ever. But again, what we do or how we navigate in our life also takes us to many places. Or even if we are in the same room, even like a time like pandemic, our world is not limited within that small city or small town or village or the country that we come from. The level of South Asia is something that I also have to be conscious about, because of course I am from here and I have grown up in certain way from a certain family in a certain country or city. But if I look at my life for the last 5-10 years, I am also exposed to many other things, many other thoughts, ideas, places, spaces, and even in my practice that has a engagement and effects. So from this work, the last work that I mean the third work that I'm showing in this exhibition, which I think brings those ideas, which has also this, there is this famous line, right? Like once I wanted to title the work called The Pale Blue Dot, which is basically what Carl Sagan said, which one of the photograph that was taken from outer space, where there is a very tiny dusty particle in the image, which is basically earth. And he said it very profoundly and beautifully that all our love, our hatred, our fights, our sorrows, our angers, uh, love, family, everything is contained in that pale blue dot. So in one of the image in that video or film, you will see one pale blue dot. Maybe that's something different, but that work takes on that other ideas of what is being now in terms of also how we live in a different kind of cosmopolitan reality, but also how we experience image, how we look at image, how we create image in this time, and how we also see them and can or cannot remember them anymore. So in that room, obviously it will be difficult to probably stand and talk about it, but you will see a lot of different subjects. They are all coming together, sometimes once in and all, sometimes pausing, sometimes shuffling within each other, but creating different meaning. Um, but I think that work takes the idea of time in a different way, which is probably more connected with the time we are living now. Where this works, we see time in a much more slow paced manner. The last work, where time is almost collapsing into each other, but still addressing certain existential concerns regarding death and mortality.
Let's walk towards that space so that we can see some more of the show. Yeah, I'd like to, maybe we can stand here, also frame you right here, and maybe you can talk a little bit about, as maybe we'll venture into that room a little later, but if you could talk to us a little bit about, as you mentioned, this time in our lives, and what we were looking at a little bit earlier when I was asking you about what you printed your photographs on, the different media that we printed on. You had also mentioned that you kind of completed the last work in this exhibition at the time of the pandemic.
Right. Just before the
just before the pandemic. And there was in your mind also, there was a distinctness between the process deployed for this kind of work and what you were trying to bring about in a sense of media, but also in a sense of receptivity and interactivity with the audience that is in the news body of work or that body of work. So could you talk about, maybe this is the hat you will have to wear as a pedagogue a little bit, is your sense of, media culture right now. One thing I remember, I come back again to, a school like Pathshala, because I remember there was a distinct moment at which its name was changed from a photography school to a media school. I think that happened, I'm forgetting, some years ago. But there was a moment at which that shift occurred, as far as I remember. And that has also meant that, how we document our lives ourselves, what we say about them, how we project ourselves, how the public receives it through new media has changed so drastically. As a practitioner, but also as someone who's a professor and a teacher, what is your sense of the changing media history? What does that do to bodies of work? What has it done to your work?
I think if I start from myself, I think I started photography with a phone. No, it's a very different start. Like, I have known my friends who have worked with film cameras. Obviously, my exposure to a device was a phone. In the very early days of smartphone, I think smartphone also was about to just arrive, but of course, then I went to, I enjoyed that process of image making and I fell in love with it. I went to a school which used to be South Asian Institute of Photography. Now it is South Asian Media Institute. But that school has obviously a very strong ground on the photography practice, right? So going there obviously made me aware of many other kind of practice and subjects that are can be explored through photography, but also that has those works can take also long term, because we often do long term works or with a certain idea, that we want to work about, let's say, my grandparents, for example, right, or this work which is about partition. But what is also image making can also be very deeply rooted in our everyday to-day life. And what those images become, what can that speak of myself or ourselves. So for me, that was always, I think, from the very beginning, I was curious to work with sound, video, moving image, or even still image, and but how they can be experienced differently. So this works obviously is much more, I think, grounded in traditional practice, and also how we're experiencing it now on paper, on certain kind of paper on the wall. But if you think about current time, most of the time we are so much consumed with image as all on a screen.
Yeah.
And I think that work, the Rashmi, which means a ray of light, and the ray is often, we are always sucked into that ray in our hands. I'm making so many photographs through that device constantly. And how much of those photographs I remember, how much of those photographs becomes an archive. What is archive now? What is the difference between the archive that I have in that room from my family album, and now our family pictures, which are all in the device. But anyway, there are so many different, obviously, points of intersections in Rashmi has. So I needed also a way to show it, which brings that complexity, I think.
It's interesting, this idea of the ray of light. Um, I was just reading something the other day called the emission theory. I don't know if you read it, but please have a look. It talks about how when people were thinking, I think this goes back to Greek metaphysics, when people were thinking about the question of reading and illumination, it began with the emission theory, which is that our eyes shout out a ray of light at objects. It's a very interesting parallel to your work, the emission theory. Anyway, but apart from that, what I'm also thinking, as you talk about media history, but also as we look at these works, the beauty of these works for me also lies in the fact that nature has taken over. There's an ecological impulse to this work. There's something that life cannot stop because there is a kind of, political rivalry. And we're looking at a very distinct point in the world right now. There's a war going on. We see it in media every day. 166 days of the war in Ukraine, 100, it's day by day, assessment. And it makes me sort of think about what a photographic history or memory does, where its relevance lies, what it means to a generation to see this place, which is completely out of time and space. It looks otherworldly. It looks like it's not seen life, but what's interesting is that it is full of life. Maybe decay is part of it, but life has not stopped.
Right. No.
And maybe that is also a very hopeful place that these photographs come from. They are serene somewhere. There's a tranquility to them. There's a sense that you can enter them and they are inviting. They're not forbidding. I don't know if that is something that you thought about while you were approaching these monuments, or you were approaching this space, of course. You can say a little bit about what your approach to this space was, because obviously you spent time there, a lot of time there, and you thought about how you were going to frame it eventually.
No, absolutely. The aspect of nature, which I haven't talked much, of course, because there are things that also you let it be there and people to read that. No, so I think mostly talked about the context, but actually the work is about how nature takes over, right? It will never stop. That's why I was talking about power or certain structures of power, which becomes relics, but it is enveloped. The whole work is enveloped by so much plants and foliage and greens, and that was my hope. I feel for this work, or this when I look at this in a way. Even in Rashmi, you will see a lot of elements of nature, because Rashmi do talks about certain more hyper real world, but there is a very strong presence of nature that comes back, and that is probably because how my life is also often, going and navigating into these two extremes. Sometimes maybe very urban, and sometimes it's much more in the remote, very outskirts of our taken over, civilization nowadays. But one of the book that I was reading, which had a big impact, was by this writer James Lovelock, who introduced the theory, the Gaia theory, where he talks about the Earth is one single living organism, and everything, the plants, the insects, the humans, is just part of that larger organism. So even that you also can see a reflection of this. But the book that I read was more about this idea of Novacene, which is what he calls what will come after Anthropocene, right? And we are, according to him, Anthropocene is what we are now living and almost in the end, but there will be the new age. So he talks about the new age, but a lot of things when he describes Anthropocene and many other elements which created that often occurs in Rashmi. It is also visually explored or constructed in a way. How do I felt in around 2020 or before 2020? When we think about image from the 60s or 70s, there are certain colors, certain kind of quality grains. We there's an image, the idea of image that is in our head. But when we think about now, what will be the image will look like in few years. So Rashmi also plays with that a little bit. But nature obviously plays a big role, obviously, in this work, for sure.
Thank you.